Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room, guys. I hope you are doing fantastically and that you're excited about discussing the INFJ's weaknesses, also to be interpreted as areas of growth. This video is not supposed to be a criticism of this beautiful, inspiring type, but to look at particular areas of growth / weaknesses that I have observed. This is mainly based on empirical observation, informed by some theory, principally developed in this book, The Ecstatic Soul, which you can still get. All the links below in the description box for the maybe the authoritative philosophical exploration of the INFJ. And don't forget that I have written a new novel, The Infinite Castle, whose main character is most likely INFJ as well. So if you want to get my novel, support me, less than $10, both of these books. All the links are below. Okay, let's move on to our topic. I have decided to focus on 4 weaknesses that the INFJ seems to have. This is not to say that these 4 weaknesses overwhelm and dominate the INFJ's life. The INFJ has a lot of innate, or what looks like innate strengths as well. But in this particular video, I want to focus on the weaknesses, starting with weakness number 1, socializing. And the INFJ seems comfortable with socializing online. But, you know, this is a point that I make quite a bit in the Ecstatic Soul. Socializing online is not exactly the same as socializing offline. You have much more control over the parameters of online interaction. For example, if someone is saying things you don't like, or, you know, having a particular behavior that you are suspicious of, you can block them, you can put them on ignore. And this is not something you can do in real life. In fact, also real life is much more complex in the variety of types of information that are conveyed to you in such a way that the kind of words, the kind of things that make you suspicious of someone online may in fact not be a source of suspicion at all offline, because a sentence you might be, you know, puzzled by, or that you might dislike the implications of it, you might realize that, well, when you're in real life, you hear the tone, you see the facial expression of the person. Maybe the person is inviting a reaction and you totally misread, or you would have totally misread it if it had been online. So because of the tendency of the INFJ towards introversion, there is also a tendency to want to be in control of the particular parameters of a social interaction with other people. Because any form of social interaction where the other is part of the picture is seen as an intrusion into the INFJ sphere, just like it is in the case of any introverts. If you think about the Carl Jung, the Jungian definition of introversion, the outside world is perceived as something that intrudes upon the subject, rather than, in the case of extroversion, the subject extrudes upon the world, right? It's there's a movement outward, whereas in the case of the introvert, it's more, what is the world going to do to me and how am I going to cope with it? The thing is, and this is partly because of some specific characteristics of the INFJ personality, which you can explore in more detail in the Ecstatic Soul. This probably applies to other introverted types as well. If you dedicate your entire life to making sure that there is as few disturbances in your social environment, so that you control as much as possible, well, you won't really grow, because you grow by challenging yourself. Now, the INFJ happens to have extroverted feeling as an auxiliary function, which means that INFJs are destined in some sense to be very proficient at extroverted feeling, and extroverted feeling is their path of access to an external world that supplies them with the information they can feed into their NI in order to assume a position of, you know, seeing the exploration of the world and making sense of the world as a vocational enterprise, as a calling, if you cut yourself off from that opportunity by remaining within your very much controlled, but also small and limited and in some sense dismembered social sphere, well, you won't really get that access and you won't flourish as much as you could. So to exercise socializing a bit like a muscle, to force yourself, maybe at first, to do a little violence to yourself, to accept opportunities and to flourish within that sphere so that you can flourish and grow on your, develop your weaknesses into strengths over the long term. Now, the second weakness that I have identified, somewhat related because it involves an encounter with the other, is debating. Now, perhaps this doesn't really come as a surprise because it would be unusual to think of debater types as being comprised of, INFJs among other types. We're more likely to think about, T-types in the case of debating, because debating in some sense involves leaving your feelings aside so that you can focus on ideas. But I mean, if you add to that the fact that in the everyday experience of debates, there's a lot of hypocrisy, there's a lot of dishonesty, there's a lot of fallacious arguments that INFJs are going to be exposed to, maybe more so than other types in some cases, because INFJs are pretty good at getting gut feeling of when an argument is not honest. They're not quite as good when it comes to quickly being able to articulate what is dishonest about the argument. Now, this is linked to having very developed NI, and FE also plays a role here. But the articulation of the mechanism by which the fallacy was expressed, sometimes the tertiary TI might not be conscious enough that it can be expressed quickly and well. So INFJs can see that as making them vulnerable to, exposed to a certain kind of abuse when involved in debates. The problem is, again, it's a bit like in socializing. It's like if you deal with it, if we cope with a situation like this by avoiding it constantly, you will remain always at the same level of vulnerability. In some sense, debates, even learning to leave your feelings aside, it's not something that's innate to T-types. It's also something that you just become used to through working. It's like it's a little bit like, sometimes I'm fascinated and I have immense respect for people who work in hospitals and I'm wondering, like, how can they manage? But it also becomes something that, like, the power to cope is something that they grow. They don't start with the same level, same ability to cope that they develop 10 years later, when they have to perhaps assist someone who's on the brink of death, and they have to deal with death, and they have to deal with saving lives. And I mean, obviously you're not at the same level of readiness when you're a student in medicine than you are 5 years later, 10 years later. And that's a much bigger example. What I mean is that when it comes to debating, sometimes you have to defend your ideas, because it's going to be very unsatisfying to just let other people dominate with their ideas that you don't agree with, and not dare to disagree with them because you're afraid of the conflictual attendant possibilities that come with it. Again, it's a bit like a muscle. You don't need to constantly get involved in debates. You don't need to pick a fight with everyone. But if you notice that there are certain people who seem more or less honest, they don't seem to be vicious, they don't seem to deliberately troll other people, but you don't agree with them, it's good to venture a disagreement and try to see where it goes. And even if it doesn't go well the first time and you think afterwards, I could have said this that way, and that's fine. You'll get better over time, okay? Now, the third weakness that I have identified is the weakness of improvising. So improvising, most often associated with, again, extroverts, P-types especially. Now, INFJs, being introverts, J-types, are much more comfortable, again, with circumstances that they have planned more or less in advance. The level of advanced planning is not necessarily very developed because they're light J-type, not heavy J-types, INFJs, that is. But usually they need to have a broad idea and outline of, what's on the horizon. And again, it's linked to this idea of control. INFJ is finding it quite hard to surrender this sense of control and saying, okay, I have no idea where I'm going tomorrow, this weekend. I'm just going to explore that city and see what happens. Now, here, one of the best kinds of advice I can give you is if you have FP friends, EFP friends, for instance, sometimes even IFP friends, to hit them up and see what their plans are at the weekends, because these types are very, very good at saying, why don't we do this? Again, the perspective is always about broadening your horizons and the sense of your different kinds of experiences of the world that you can have, because every kind of world experience, including some that in this case would be more unusual than the other ones, are ways of encountering sources of information and sources of experience which can feed into how you articulate your vision of yourself, the world, where you want the future to go, where you want your future to go. So you add meaning, because NI, in a strong sense, is a function of meaning creation, and INFJs are a lot of their satisfaction in life depends on that capacity for meaning creation to be stable and fruitful. But it's a mistaken idea to think that if your environment is static, then if you have meaning at one point, that will remain the case because the environment doesn't move, because the world actually moves forward and you get older. So it's important that you continue supplying your NI and auxiliary FE, the universal function when it comes to, meaning of human life and so on, to continually supply it with new information. And that's done through some extroverted activities that would qualify as extroverted. Socializing, debating, improvising, but you can do that. And make use of the friends you have, if you have friends in the real world. Because again, if it's about going to explore a city, you can't do that with an online friend. You can do that with an offline friend, okay? And finally, weakness number 4, and I'll finish with this one, is linked to improvising. You'll understand straight away. It's exploring the unfamiliar. Exploring the unfamiliar is something that would be more traditionally associated with the gathering function. Now, those who have read the Ecstatic Soul know that by gathering function, I mean the functions of extroverted perception, principally. So extroverted intuition, NE, and extroverted sensation, SE. SE inferior for the INFJ means that there's a lot of unconscious gathering going on, and that comes with all sorts of existential challenges for the INFJ, including a tendency to be alienated from the external world and to have difficulty accessing these new sources of information, which translates itself concretely into the fact that sometimes INFJs can have quite clear or quite stable visions, and they're very identified with their visions of, again, the meaning of where they are, where they want things to go. But sometimes that vision it's not as fluid as it could be. And in some sense, is a fluid function, but if it doesn't have a lot of material to process, a lot of material to work with, it's not going to be able to remain fluid forever. So you need that new information. And this is perhaps the biggest kind of implicit cross-cutting theme of this entire video. It's like accessing new sources of information, new life experiences to keep, in some sense, to keep your NI happy, to keep your NI satisfied, sated, and contented. You need to challenge yourself to, at some point you say, okay, these are my interests usually when it comes to movies. And then you see a poster and just something about it just resonates with you, you're curious about it. Instead of stopping and saying, well, looking it up, it looks like it's actually kind of a romantic comedy or whatever. It's like, why not explore it? Don't judge too early and too soon what you're going to think of a film, of a particular plan of a book, exploring genres that you might not be, that might not be your go-to genres, just for the sake of enjoying the newness of the experience, and you might very well be surprised and broaden your horizons as a result. So exploring the unfamiliar is not something that you need to do in a social context. You can do that online by taking an interest in new topics. If you're someone who's very atheistic, to read more on religion. If you're someone who's very religious, to give a chance to thinkers that were more atheistic, to broaden your perspective and to make sure that your functions of processing meaning, NI, accompanied with FE, remain given lots of different options. And if they continue making the same choices as to where they want to go, those choices will be all the stronger if they have been selected from a broad arena of possibilities. Okay, let me know in the comments if that made any sense and if you agree. And I hope that I was good at making those weaknesses clearly areas of growth rather than something innate that INFJs can never work to fix. Okay, so I'll see you soon. Remember that you can follow me on Patreon. The link to the Patreon page is below. That really helps me. You can equally help me by buying my books. Talk to you soon, guys. Bye-bye.